Passer rating is one of the go-to ways to evaluate quarterbacks, but it's not as reliable as you might think. For a majority of football's history, the passing game has played second fiddle to the run game, but increasingly the football world has woken up to the fact that passing plays are often the more efficient choice. This has led to an explosion in passing concepts, and that in turn has led to a lot of different ideas on how to structure offenses. There are many ways to split up offensive philosophies. Firstly, you could create broad categories based loosely off coaching trees and common concepts. That leaves you with divisions like the flex bones of the service academies, the air raid, run and shoot, or quote-unquote pro-style offenses. This is the most common way people tend to talk about offenses, and ones that video games like Madden and NCAA tend to rely most on. The problem with this is increasingly people are just running what they would call spread offenses, and because of that, the term spread has become so broad as to be virtually meaningless. So how do we categorize different spreads? I think this is all still an area of debate, but what I've noticed is there seems to be a divide between offenses that focus on overall efficiency as measured by success rate and offenses that emphasize explosiveness. Success rate ranks teams highly by their ability to move the ball forward on each snap, but gives no extra credit for getting big plays. So an offense that ranks highly in success rate but low in explosive play rate tends to move the ball slowly but consistently down the field. Think of systems like the flexbone, which run the ball with a 3 yards and a cloud of dust mentality, but it's not exclusive to running systems. In fact, air raid teams also kind of fit the mindset, but they trade the plodding consistency of the run game with the plodding consistency of the short passing game. Systems that prioritize explosiveness, on the other hand, aren't necessarily trying to grind teams down, but are instead hunting for big play opportunities with deep shots. These kind of spreads often prioritize outside runs to try to get the edge, which then, in turn, opens up shots off play action. And all of this makes a lot of sense. An article written by Football Study Hall in 2014, but whose concepts are still relevant today, whittles down football into the 5 most important factors to win, based on win probability. Here's the relevant excerpt of the article. The 5 factors are explosiveness, efficiency, drive finishing, field position, and turnovers. 3 of those are things that any team can work towards. You can have reliable plays that work in the red zone that you feel comfortable with. You can stress the importance of ball security in practice, and it never hurts to devote a scholarship to a punter who can flip the field. But those first 2, explosiveness and efficiency, feel a bit exclusive to each other. Like, who wouldn't want to be able to complete 30-yard passes at a 75% clip? So most teams have to kind of focus on one and hope the other naturally presents itself. So how does one focus on explosiveness over success rate, or vice versa? Well, the obvious answer is to try to push the ball vertically or keep your passes short. Florida State's head coach, Mike Norvell, who generally creates explosive offenses, typically finishes over 50th percentile in air yards per attempt, but I think we can do a little bit better than that. So I made a chart that looks at how different targeted routes create these different effects. I call this the efficiency-explosiveness curve. To the top left, you see routes on average lead to good success rates, but don't often create explosives. And down to the right, you see highly explosive routes that have lower completion percentages. While a lot of this seems a bit self-explanatory, there are some interesting things here. Most throws behind the line of scrimmage tend to be pretty mediocre in both explosiveness and success rate, but that doesn't mean that they're always bad plays. These kind of screens often go for a lot of yards when they do hit. An explosive halfback screen, for instance, averages almost 30 yards per completion, where an average explosive hitch is about 20. I like this chart because you can generally get an indication of whether a team is success rate focused or explosiveness focused with a quick look at the graph. For instance, in 4 of the 5 years that PFF has tracked targeted routes, Mike Norvell's teams have been above the 50th percentile in targeting wide receiver/tight end screens, wheels, posts, in routes, halfback screens, go routes, and comebacks. To me, there's a pretty clear theme here. His go-to routes tend to fall on the explosiveness side of the chart. Compare that to Clemson, who we know has emphasized success rate this season. They were above average in targeting hitches, flare routes, crossing routes, slants, pivot routes, and in routes. While these two seem to lie a bit on the extreme, they emphasize a common split in how modern spread offenses are run. What's kind of crazy about all this is it happens to play into everybody's favorite method of evaluating quarterbacks: quarterback rating. See, QB rating gives more credit for throwing a touchdown on any given attempt than it takes away for throwing an incompletion, and that plays out in the stats. There's a positive correlation between explosive routes and routes that result in higher passer rating, where there's actually a negative correlation between efficient routes and rating. So it follows that if you want to maximize quarterback efficiency, you would want to lean heaviest on the routes that fall on the explosiveness side of the curve outlined earlier. We can look at this another way. Here's all the routes targeted last season in all of college football, ranked by resulting passer rating, and here's all the routes that I established earlier that Norvell uses more than the average team. While the correlation isn't perfect, you see that his quarterbacks tend to target routes that result in higher ratings overall. So while these graphs are all well and good, these don't really tell a full story. They require context of the other routes that surround them and the players that actually run the routes. In fact, if we look at some of these routes in particular, they can be kind of niche. Wheel routes tend to result in great passer ratings, but even FSU targets them on only 1.5 of their passes over the past 2 seasons, and they're in the 89th percentile. When you actually break down the routes that have had the biggest positive impact on FSU's passer rating over the past 2 years, it's been halfback screens, which logically makes sense since it's a high passer rating play, but then it gets kind of weird with corner routes, slants, and in routes, which are generally poor on their own at producing high passer ratings. The easiest explanation of this is since FSU tends to throw deep more than the average team, it opens up the underneath throws, which in turn become the more efficient plays for their offense. If this is true, you would expect the opposite to be true for a success rate focused team, and you do when you look at Clemson, where goes and posts are 2 of their 4 best routes at producing high passer rating. In fact, if we expand this out to all of college football, you start to see a similar trend. The more often routes are thrown, the more likely defenses are able to shut it down. This could also potentially mean that these routes, which tend to be the deeper routes that we've already established tend to lead to higher passer ratings, may not actually be inherently better. This effect might be merely a product of them just being less used on a snap-by-snap basis throughout all of college football. And because of this evening effect, teams that lean more heavily on the deep ball don't tend to outpace their success rate focused brother in terms of passer rating. I think this is kind of what's meant by when people say Jimmy and Joe's are more important than X's and O's. Despite the fact that these teams with high air yards per attempt tend to target the routes that result in high passer ratings, it doesn't always reflect in a team's overall passer rating. A lot of this has to do with talent discrepancies per team. A team like Oregon was just so much more talent rich than everyone else in the Pac-12 last year that it really didn't matter what they did. They were going to be pretty good at throwing the football. But along those lines, something stands out a bit when you highlight just the top 20 teams in terms of talent composites going into 2023. Firstly, now 12 of the top 20 teams are in the upper right quadrant. And notice there's no top talent teams that really fit into the lower right quadrant. These are teams that both push the ball deep and struggled putting up good passer ratings. To me, it almost seems like these more talented teams can succeed whether or not they prioritize the deeper routes, but the talented teams that tend to underachieve are the ones that don't push the ball down the field. This is further illustrated by the company in those respective quadrants. Washington, Kansas, Ole Miss, Mizzou, and Oregon State are teams who dramatically overperformed offensively compared to what talent rating sites would predict. Okay, now to finish on an FSU note. Norvell is a vertical guy, and as football stands in 2023, I would argue that pushing the ball downfield helps his quarterbacks in terms of passer rating. That's not to discount what his quarterbacks have done, but it is to say that Mike will do what he can to put whoever is behind center in the best position possible to put up some serious numbers. Thanks for watching. I hope some of you caught on that this tends to be a very quarterback-centric approach. In my next video, I hope to dive more into where this kind of offense tends to struggle in the passing game and what FSU can do next season to avoid those issues. Reminder to like and subscribe if you want to catch that one, and meet me over on Noles247 if you want to further this conversation. Thanks.